Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible now.
Good morning, everybody. Dear Professor Vinay Lal of UCLA, USA, my colleagues Dr. Ratnam Wattal, Convener IQAC, and Dr. Ravi Ranjan, Convener Alumni Affairs Committee, all participants of this international webinar, and my dear students.
Sir, unmute please unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible now.
Good morning, everybody. Dear Professor Vinay Lal of UCLA, USA, my colleagues Dr. Ratnam Wattal, Convener IQAC, and Dr. Ravi Ranjan, Convener Alumni Affairs Committee, all participants of this international webinar, and my dear students. I am delighted to welcome you all to this international webinar on the cultural histories and politics of coronavirus pandemic. Today's and contemporary topic which focuses on how this pandemic has changed our day-to-day life and restructuring the human history. The political aspect of pandemic is unfolding day by day and putting a tough challenge on human well-being and nations' economies. I am thankful to Professor Vinay Lal, who has kindly accepted our invite, now a well-known name in Zakir Husain Delhi College fraternity. Professor Lal, a historian by training, has dealt with the impact and influences of coronavirus pandemic in his just released book, The Fury of COVID-19, published by the internationally acclaimed publisher Pan Macmillan in the year 2020. Now I request Dr. Ravi Ranjan to introduce the honorable speaker and to conduct the further proceedings. Once again, I welcome you all and wish this program a grand success. Thank you very much, Dr. Ravi Ranjan, for giving this opportunity to introduce Professor Lal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. And we all know that there is no much introduction required for Professor Vinay Lal. Professor Vinay Lal is a cultural critic, blogger, public commentator, and professor of history at UCLA. His 17 authored and edited book includes The Empire of Knowledge, Culture and Plurality in the Global Economy, History. Thank you, sir. And we all know that there is no much introduction. The history of history. Professor Vinay Lal is a cultural critic, blogger, public commentator at UCLA. His authored and edited book includes The Empire of Knowledge, Culture and Political Hinduism, The Religious Imagination of Public Sphere, the 2 volumes on Oxford Anthology of Modern Indian City and Indian Civilization Futures. His intellectual interests include Indian history, global politics, historiography, popular culture, cinema, Gandhi, and politics of knowledge system. He blogs regularly at vinaylal.worldpress.com and his interviews are easily accessible through YouTube. So he has just recently published a book called The Fury of COVID-19, and I am just showing the book. This is I think the first launch of the book. Somehow I grabbed the book from the publisher yesterday, and this book is a timely intervention, as Ashish Nandi has quoted that no one till now has written on the coronavirus against the cultural backdrop like this book. And this book is basically talking about how coronavirus has changed the world. The world as we knew it has changed, and the fury of COVID has unleashed new forces, leaving us with uncertain future. Though its fatality rate in comparison with some previous epidemics such as Black Death and Spanish flu of 1820 is strikingly low, and though it follows the path of epidemics such as HIV, SARS, Ebola, the coronavirus pandemic has produced outcomes which are altogether unprecedented. There is no other instance where the world was over 3 months brought to a standstill and the global economy shuttered. Most countries imposed lockdown and shut down their borders. So this was the first kind of experiences that human history has experienced, Now I request Professor Vinay Lal, we are already delayed by 10-15 minutes, to start his lecture without any further delay. Professor Vinay Lal.
Thank you, Ravi, for the introduction and for inviting me. And my thanks to Zakir Husain College at the University of Delhi and the Department of Political Science for this invitation. I should say one thing, though, first at the outset. I think we have a technical problem here because everything that is being said by anyone gets relayed a minute later once again. I think the YouTube channel on which this is playing is not completely synchronous for some reason. So I don't know if that problem has been solved. Right now, the voice isn't there, but if it is, then I'll point it out. But there's been this constant background noise as well. So let me try to explain a few things that interest me about the coronavirus pandemic, and what it is that prompted me to actually write this book. Because the sweep of this book is really very, very large. It looks not just at the coronavirus pandemic as it has played out in India, the United States, in Sweden, China, but there's also a discussion of it in France, in Germany, even in Cuba, for example, Vietnam. But it's not simply a matter of going from one country to another. The book also engages with very large questions, all of which could be addressed at much greater length, at much more substantial length, and will no doubt be addressed by many others in time to come. Because I think that this pandemic is something that is so distinct in the history of our experience, that I think that there will be a great many people who will be turning their attention to it. So let me begin with my first proposition. The first proposition is that this coronavirus pandemic is in fact actually unprecedented in human experience. All right, and I want to explain very clearly what I mean by that, because I'm a historian, and historians do not like to think that anything is unprecedented. If you go far back in time or you search hard enough, you'll always find a precedent for something. We know, for example, that there have been many other pandemics in the past as well. So why do I say that this uh, pandemic is really unprecedented in human experience? And when I say that, I don't just mean that it's unprecedented because there is no living person who has experienced anything of this kind. I mean that historically, I don't think we can really find something exactly comparable to this pandemic. When you speak to the epidemiologists, they often tell you that when you've seen one pandemic, you've only seen one pandemic. You haven't seen all of them. We might think that they all look more or less the same, but the epidemiologists say that if you've seen one, you've only seen one. Yet there is a different way in which actually this pandemic is distinct. And the reason it's distinct is because nowhere in history do we have a record of state intervention on such a massive scale across large parts of the world. Okay, that's something that I really want to insist on. Now, let me take a few examples. Because if we're looking at this as an unprecedented event in human history, I mean, if you're looking at the fatality rate, and if you're looking at the death toll, the Black Death in the 14th century is estimated to have wiped out perhaps as much as a third of the entire population of Europe. If you remember that the population of Europe at that time was much smaller as well than it is now. So proportionately, the death toll in the Black Death dwarfs, exceeds by orders of magnitude the death toll that we have seen in this particular pandemic, right? And nonetheless, I still want to insist on the point that it's actually unprecedented. You take another example, 1918, 1920, the influenza epidemic of 1918-20, which is now estimated to have caused the deaths of 50 to 100 million people. And at the present moment, we worldwide we have lost about 1.2 million people worldwide. And it may well be that if this pandemic continues on for several more months and perhaps even into 2021, well, it may well be the case that we may end up with 2-3 million people dead. But we're still far removed from the kind of death toll that we had in the 1918-20 pandemic. So to understand the point that I'm making, what I want to do is I want to turn very briefly to 1957 and to 1968. 1957 is when something called the Asian flu took place, and 1968 is when the Hong Kong flu took place. Now, both of these are influenza epidemics, and both of them are estimated to have caused the death of at least 1 million people. It is possible that the Hong Kong flu actually caused the death of perhaps 2 to 3 million, but the minimum estimate is 1 million, for each of these two pandemics. The astonishing thing is that history books say almost nothing about these two pandemics. Right? And then one would have to speculate about why that's the case, because remember that in the present pandemic, back in March, about 10,000 people had died by middle of March. And at that point, at least half of that death toll was the death toll from China, right? Because the pandemic was just, the virus was now transmitting to other countries, to other continents. And yet in mid-March, the world had almost shut down. Countries started to shut down. And in India itself, you will all recall that the Prime Minister issued orders for a lockdown on March 24th, right? With 4 hours notice to the entire population. And it is around that time that most countries started to go into lockdown. And so what we're saying is that even though 10,000 people had died, there was such an extreme reaction. Whereas in 1957 and 1968, over 1 million people died. And yet those two epidemics or pandemics are really no better than a simple footnote in history textbooks. Now, I won't get into the reasons because that's a subject for another lecture. I won't get into the reasons why, all the reasons why those pandemics have been forgotten. But I want to now suggest very clearly what it is that is really different and distinct about the pandemic in the midst of which we are now. And that is that this coronavirus pandemic has witnessed state intervention at a level that has never been witnessed in history before. Right? Where in each country, the state basically commands the economy, the state essentially commands that schools, universities, museums, businesses, shops, factories, that everything will just be shut down. And where the state essentially commands everyone to go into self-quarantine. We have not seen something of this kind ever before in history today. All right, so that is really the most distinctive aspect of this particular coronavirus. Now, the second thing I really want to touch upon very briefly, and much of what I'm going to say draws upon things that I have discussed in my book, which Dr. Ranjan had mentioned at the beginning, The Fury of COVID-19, which was just published literally a week ago by Pan Macmillan in India. But what I want to do here at the moment is I want to suggest by looking at a few countries how it is that countries actually reacted or responded to the coronavirus and why they did so in the manner that they did. All right. So you take for example a country such as China. So I think all of you are at least have some rudimentary awareness of how it is that China attempted to deal actually with the pandemic, to mitigate it, contain it, and to eventually suppress it when it first broke out. And here I'm not speaking at very great length, although I'll be happy to take questions about it. I'm not speaking about China's role in actually having obfuscated the truth to some degree, because I think there's no question that China did disguise some elements of this narrative and was very late, as was the case in 2002. So some of you may not be aware of the fact that this coronavirus is also known as SARS, SARS-CoV-2, and because in some ways it is, if I may put it this way, a continuation of the coronavirus that we had which was in 2002-3, which is known as SARS, right? And this is SARS-2. Now in 2002-3, it is also the case that that originated in China, and we know now for certain because there is a large historical record about it. A number of people have discussed this, that China attempted to actually disguise what was happening at that point in time. But at that time, WHO was in fact a much more energetic and vigorous body than it has been in recent months. Because one of the disturbing things about the WHO today is that far from leading the world, it has in many cases followed it. That some of the guidelines that it has issued, including the guidelines about masking, are guidelines that were really issued very late in the day, and should doubtless have been issued much earlier than they were. But in 2002, WHO actually did play a significant role in stemming the rise of SARS. All right, which is much less the case at this point in time. However, the reason I mention this is simply to say that we know that this virus originated in China, and that China took extreme draconian measures to actually mitigate and contain the virus. So we have firsthand accounts of people who live in Wuhan who talk about how at 3 a.m. the state police would arrive at their door, break down the door, drag people away, take them into a quarantine. And of course, what China did was it enforced an enormously rigid and rigorously enforced lockdown. And the consequence of that was that, of course, that China has been in many ways able to suppress this virus. Now, there's a very interesting set of questions which arises from that, which again, I'm not really able to take up in any great detail at this point in time, but they're discussed to some extent in the book. And that has to do with whether other countries should actually emulate China, or whether, in fact, one should also at the same time be deeply suspicious of the kinds of measures that were taken by China. But what we are finding here is that in China's response to this, what China did is what an authoritarian state typically does. Now, this contrasts with the kind of approach that has been taken in the United States, where a huge number of factors account for why the United States today has the largest number of cases, and more significantly, the largest number of deaths, because the total number of cases in India is now almost very close to the United States. And it looked 3 weeks ago as though India would probably exceed the US, but numbers have started to go down in India, whereas in the last couple of weeks, the numbers have actually increased in the United States, right? The approach here is dictated by the fact that in many ways, states' rights are far more important in the United States and in the US Constitution. So even though many people believe that Trump should be personally held responsible for it, a view that I share to some degree, the only reason I don't share that view entirely is because I think the nature of civil society in the United States is considerably complicated. For example, there are large segments of the population of this country who have a very deep suspicion of state intervention, right? And so the kind of state intervention that we saw in China is, it seems to me, almost inconceivable in the United States. And so the approach here was an approach which was a much more, if I may put it this way, decentralized approach, a kind of a patchwork approach, an approach which essentially stipulated that each state, and within a state there might be 50 different jurisdictions, and these 50 different jurisdictions may actually be at odds with each other, but it essentially left it to each state and to the jurisdiction of each state to try to see what it could do about containing the pandemic. Now you can take a third approach. That approach would be that of a country like Sweden. And what Sweden attempted to do is something similar to the United Kingdom in some respects. What it attempted to do, at least in the conventional view, is it attempted to actually achieve herd immunity. Now we all know that herd immunity can only substantially be achieved in two fundamental ways. One of the ways in which you achieve herd immunity is through vaccines, and the other way that you achieve it, and of course this has some relationship to vaccines, but a vaccine may be very long in arriving on the scene. So the second way that you can attempt to achieve herd immunity is if you say that there's going to be a sufficient number of people who have been infected, and once they have been sufficient number of people have been infected, the pathogen will not find a host. And eventually the virus will disappear. Now, what this percentage is something that is still disputed, but by and large, there is agreement that generally speaking, in order to achieve herd immunity, we have to say that about 60% of the population of a community where herd immunity is being sought to be achieved must have been infected. All right. Now, of course, this raises enormous ethical questions, and it raises enormous ethical questions because the question is, are we going to allow people to be infected? I mean, is this the way to achieve herd immunity? And this was one of the criticisms that was leveled at Sweden. Now, so to understand how Sweden was actually quite different in its response, just momentarily consider the fact that Sweden is part of the Nordic Union. It's one of those countries that is considered to be a Scandinavian countries. And if you look at Denmark and Norway and Finland, so right, the other three countries here which form part of that union, and with which we can make a comparison of Sweden, what we find is that the number of people who were infected in these three other countries and the number of people who died is only a very small fraction of the number of people who were infected and who died in Sweden, right? I mean, the ratio can be as much as 10 to 1, 10 times as many people died in Sweden, even after you account for obviously the difference in population. If you look at it proportionately, 10 times as many people died in Sweden as did in Denmark or Norway. What is the difference? In Denmark and Norway, they imposed a lockdown, right? So they essentially did what most other countries had done. Sweden did not do so. Why did Sweden not do so, right? And one reason it didn't do so is because, as I've suggested to you all, Sweden, it is argued that the chief epidemiologist, the state epidemiologist of Sweden, decided that the best course of action was not to impose a lockdown, because in imposing a lockdown, what you essentially do is you fracture the nature of civil society, right? That was the fundamental concern, that when you impose a lockdown, you're going to actually disrupt everyday life very considerably. You may be putting a lot of people out of work. You may be actually making people hungry, particularly people who haven't had work for a long period of time and are living from one paycheck to another, right? But if you are doing cultural history, then you begin to arrive at an understanding which is yet more complex. And what I'm going to suggest here is that actually there are lots of reasons why Sweden decided that it was going to take its own path. One of the reasons why Sweden took its own path is because Sweden is a country where, at least in the self-representation of the state, all right, and the self-representation of the state, the civil society there is based on a foundation of trust. That is that, for example, if a person gets infected or thinks that he or she is infected, that it's a kind of society where that person would exercise responsibility. And even though Sweden didn't impose a lockdown, the state did issue instructions saying that, well, if you think you have the virus or if you're displaying any of the symptoms, this is what you should do. That out of concern for everyone else, you should self-quarantine yourself, right? Now, Sweden also has a tradition where it has charted a very independent path in most respects. I mean, all the Scandinavian countries, in some respects, have charted an independent path. But I think it needs to be said that Sweden has charted an independent path to a greater degree. So, for example, in World War II, Sweden was neutral, all right? Sweden also likes to think of itself as, in some ways, as a big brother in this cohort of Scandinavian countries. Some of the world's most renowned companies come out of Sweden. Volvo would be a very good example. IKEA, that huge retailer of all kinds of things, including furniture and so on. These are all Swedish companies, right? So what I'm suggesting is that Sweden actually charted a very different path. And the argument here is that countries chart a different path to some extent based on their own national history, based on the disposition of their own people. And this brings me now to the example of India. So if we take a fourth example, I've looked very briefly at China, I've looked at the United States, I've looked at Sweden, and now we look at India. And I have to say right at the outset that I think that the two countries that have been most unsuccessful, okay, in being able to tackle this pandemic are undoubtedly India and the United States, both democracies. I think India to a much lesser degree, particularly today, than the United States, but nonetheless, countries which have certain kinds of democratic institutions and a certain judicial system and so on. Now, Prime Minister Modi imposed a lockdown on March 24th. And of course, it is very easy to be wise after the fact. I recognize this. And therefore, I want to say before I offer a critique of what happened in India, I want to say right at the outset that I recognize the fact that this would have been a challenge for any government, for any prime minister. All right, whatever the government might have been, whatever the nature of the person occupying the position of the prime minister, this would have been a challenge. But at the same time, I think it needs to be said that the government of India has failed miserably in being able to understand and tackle the coronavirus pandemic and to deal adequately with the needs of its subjects, with the needs of Indians, the everyday needs of Indians. For example, was any serious thought given when this lockdown was imposed with 4 hours notice, and no other country imposed a lockdown with 4 hours notice? Right? Why did India do so? Was any serious thought given to the fact that what you would have is you would have a huge number of people, which is exactly what happened in India. Within 48 hours, you had a huge number of daily wage laborers, workers, migrant laborers, right, as they're called, who made a dash for the train station, for the bus station, and who then, when they found that there was no way to get back to their village, I mean, this is the largest reverse migration that we have seen in India, because of course the most interesting thing since partition, one of the most interesting things about India, particularly in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, is the extraordinary migration from the rural areas to the urban areas, right? And this is of course one of the ways in which Indian cities have grown enormously. I mean, all one has to do is to look at Delhi and Mumbai. But in addition to that, countless number of other cities and very large towns. Here we have a reverse migration. The entire world was witness to the spectacle of tens of millions of people who were desperate to get back. Okay, desperate to get back. No arrangement was made for them. I mean, it was shocking. You know, the news stories that were circulating around the world about what was happening in India were just extraordinarily disheartening, right? And is there precedent for this? There is absolute precedence. If there were people in the government who were accustomed to reading books, who were accustomed to looking at history, who were accustomed to consulting with historians and experts and scholars, right? And people who know something, they might have reached a very different conclusion. For example, some of you, I mean, the young among you here will not remember this at all, but others will. Some of you might remember that the last plague that we had in a way in India, there had been very small plagues here and there, but the last plague that we had of any kind, which garnered the attention of the world, was in Surat in 1994. And if you read the record of what happened in Surat in 1994, the first thing you find out is that when the plague broke out, within 2 days, half the population of Surat had left the city. Because in our history, this is typically what Indians do. You know, during the Mughal period, when the villagers felt that the taxation was heavy, what did they do? To use a modern expression, they voted with their feet. They ran. They evacuated the village. Now, this is what these Indians did. And the government, of course, had no provisions for food, for example, for these people. The vast majority of migrant laborers who have been fed. I'm sorry to say, notwithstanding what the government might say, there's enough data about this. Okay, if we look for it, the vast majority of these people have actually been fed by NGOs and by social workers and communities. That's how they've been fed, right? And all of you will remember that about a month ago, when a question was posed in Parliament, how many migrant laborers' deaths have been, the government said, without blinking an eye, we have no data on this. How is it that the government has no data on this when it has data on millions of things? Because of course the implication is, well, when we have no data, essentially it means there weren't any deaths. These people simply don't exist, right? Now that has been, unfortunately, the reaction in the Indian government, right? So what I'm hearing is I'm giving you 4 different nation states. I'm looking at 4 nation states very briefly and suggesting that we have to try to understand this not simply as a matter of science and as a matter of public policy, both of which are important, but we have to understand this as a matter of national histories. What is it within the disposition of a people? What is it within the nature of the history of a country that makes it react and respond in a certain fashion? All right. Now, I could speak for hours about different aspects of the pandemic. What I want to do is I want to suggest 5 questions or 5 subjects on which it seems to me people might reflect a lot more, having to do with the coronavirus pandemic. 5 subjects, for example, which might be useful for the researcher to think about. Although in what I've already said thus far, it will be very clear to you that there's plenty of scope for people to really think and to investigate what has really been happening in the last course of the last 7, 8, 9 months. All right. So the first question has to do here with the 5 questions that I'm putting forward. Okay, and it's with these 5 questions, each of which I will discuss for about 3 to 4 minutes. It's with these questions that I'm going to conclude my remarks for today. The first question has to do with the question of the state and individual liberties. Okay, now I've already hinted at some of this thus far. All right, I've already hinted at this part, but I think that we need to understand the implications of the coronavirus pandemic with respect to the question of individual liberties and collective liberties, with respect to the question of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of movement, right? The ability to move from one place to another, because of course, at the present moment, this freedom is constrained in many countries, and the freedom of collective assembly. All right, so for example, if you take China, what did China do? China used the coronavirus pandemic opportunistically and very aggressively to crush the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Now, if you recall, this movement had been going on months before the coronavirus pandemic broke out. And one of the most encouraging aspects of this democracy movement in Hong Kong was that despite the attempts of the Chinese Communist Party, right, they were not able to actually put down this movement. Right? It has gone through various phases. There was a much earlier phase 2, 3 years ago where you had sort of the umbrella movement. But now I'm really speaking about what started happening last year. What started happening last year when the pro-democracy resistors were able to actually gain the support of huge segments of the population of Hong Kong. And the Chinese state tried all kinds of measures to contain the dissent. But they were not very successful. And the interesting thing is that it is only after the coronavirus pandemic broke out and after China had actually crushed the pandemic in China itself that they used the cover of the pandemic to crush the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. Right? And this happened 3 months ago. And one of the reasons they were able to do it also is because China had very successfully conducted a massive, if I may put it this way, propaganda mission. And this propaganda mission had various aspects to it. But one of the things that China did was it actually exported a large amount of personal protective equipment, which is needed by health workers and essential workers. It exported a large amount of personal protective equipment and hand sanitizers and masks and ventilators to a large number of countries. So many countries felt actually quite indebted to China, and China took every advantage of that to crush this pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. All right. So what does this tell us? What this tells us is this, and China is of course only the most extreme example, because if you look at what's happening worldwide, one of the things that we have seen is that since the last few years, there has been a drift towards authoritarian rule in most countries of the world, including the United States, the United Kingdom, right? The two oldest democracies, and of course our own country, India, and in addition to that, countries such as Turkey, for example, right, and Poland and Hungary, all of which have seen the rise of right-wing authoritarian movements. Right? And in each of these countries, there is demonstrable evidence of how the state has actually used the pandemic to silence people, to silence journalists, to crush dissent. Right? I mean, if we look at our own country, one of the most interesting things that was happening there, whatever your political view, and there might be people whose political view is completely that of Hindutva, right? That's their business. I'm giving you my own interpretation of what was really happening. Now, we know that one of the most interesting things that was happening in India was the movement in Shaheen Bagh. Okay, the movement in Shaheen Bagh, and we know that the state made various attempts to try to silence this movement, try to evict these women from there on the grounds that, well, they're basically clogging up public space. The people who are living there are deeply inconvenienced. You have to remember, whenever there is a movement of civil resistance, some people will be inconvenienced. If we started thinking about inconvenience, we would still be living under British rule, I can assure you. Because if people had told Gandhi and Nehru and Patel and the Indian Congress Party that we're being inconvenienced by your Satyagraha movement, right? Well, would we have had a movement of nonviolent resistance in our country, right? So this is not an argument. This argument that, well, these women who are sitting in Shaheen Bagh are inconveniencing the local residents over there. Well, if there is a serious political matter and people want to protest, they have to find a way to do it. And what is really majestic about this protest is the fact that this was actually a non-violent protest led by the people that you least expect to have actually led a movement. That is, we're talking about largely Muslim women, right? Now, whatever your opinion of that, what is very interesting about this is that when the lockdown was imposed, that very night, the government sent the police there because they had imposed a lockdown. There was a curfew. They immediately wiped out all traces of the movement. This has been completely documented, right? All the murals that were to be found in Shaheen Bagh, outside Jamia, in that whole area, all the makeshift structures, all of this was completely demolished instantly. Right? Something that the state had not been able to do in the preceding 3 to 4 months. If you look at the United States, one of the things that has happened on account of the coronavirus pandemic is that the Trump regime has used this cover of the pandemic to push through the most devastating legislation with regards to the environment. All the laws that were put into place in this country about safe water, safe air, fuel emission standards, right? Most of these laws have been considerably relaxed, especially in the last 6 months, because the Trump regime has been quite certain that people's attention is so much riveted on the coronavirus pandemic that basically it can create mayhem in other areas of life, right? And this is what I mean when I say that the pandemic has actually become a very serious problem, not simply from the point of view of health. The implications of this will have to be understood very clearly, because what we're really speaking about is the ways in which states are augmenting their power under the pretext of a crisis. And many countries according to the work that I have done, relying upon the work that has been done by hundreds of researchers, there are at least 80 countries in the world that imposed emergency legislation after the pandemic broke out. And historically speaking, it is the nature of emergency legislation, number one, that it cannot be subjected to judicial review. Number two, international human rights legislation is not relevant when a country actually imposes emergency legislation. That is, there's always a provision that we are exempt from these international human rights provisions, right? And most alarmingly, what is true of emergency legislation always is that even though it is claimed to be temporary, it often becomes permanent, right? So what we will have to think about, and this is what I'm suggesting to the young students and to the researchers, is that we're going to have to think about how state has become much stronger relative to civil society, and what are the various ways in which individual liberties and freedoms are being infringed in consequence of the pandemic. And you know that there is a massive increase in surveillance apps, in facial recognition technologies, in artificial intelligence, in surveillance technologies, in the use of drones, for example, all of that. All right, so that's one set of questions. The second is this: the question of social distancing. I think social distancing is a very substantial problem for all countries to think about. It is a very substantial problem because in most countries of the world, and particularly the so-called advanced industrialized nations such as the United States and the United Kingdom, there is another pandemic. That pandemic has been going on for a very long period of time. It's much less a problem in India for various reasons. I'm speaking about the pandemic of loneliness. Loneliness. You will be astonished to learn that 2 years ago, the United Kingdom appointed a minister of loneliness. The problem was so acute in the United Kingdom that the British cabinet decided that they had to appoint a minister whose portfolio would include trying to understand why is it that so many people in the United Kingdom are feeling lonely. Because of course, loneliness is a pathology. Loneliness is very different from solitude. We must understand the difference between the two. I cannot explain it at very great length now, but solitude is something that you choose. It's something that you choose. And solitude is something that can be very healthy for you because one of the diseases of modern civilization is the fact that people are unable to sit down by themselves and read a book for 2 or 3 hours, for example. Everybody needs to be talking on the phone, chatting all the time. What is so important going on in the world that people need to be chatting and talking about all kinds of things endlessly, right? Why do they need to be rushing around from one place to another all the time? It's partly because we don't learn to live with ourselves, right? That's solitude. Loneliness is very different. Loneliness is imposed. It has to do with the breakdown of community structures, of family structures, all kinds of things. Now the guidelines that were issued all over the world is be at least 6 feet away from anyone else if you have to go out, but don't go out at all, and don't touch anyone. Don't touch anyone, right? Those were the guidelines. And from all over the world, we had heartbreaking stories of grandchildren whose grandparents were dying and they couldn't see their grandparents, or children whose parents were dying and they couldn't be close to their parents, right? Because of all of these mandates. Now, this means that we have to think a great deal about such things as touch, sparsh, right? अगर स्पर्श नहीं रहेगा तो हमारी इंसानियत रहेगी या नहीं? Do we remain humans if we do not have the wherewithal, the ability to touch someone, right? Because it is through touch that we create intimacy, to familiarity, notions of community, all of that, right? There is, of course, a much larger social dimension. And here again, I mean, that's why I said these are questions for researchers and students and scholars to think about. I'm not giving you the whole large narrative, because on each of these points, one could speak for 3 to 4 hours. The social dimension of this aspect of it is that in India, we may not have the problem of loneliness to the degree to which that problem exists in countries such as Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom. But in India, we have another problem, and we have the problem of touch. We already have such rigid rules about who we can eat with, who people will eat with, jat pat, right? I mean, how many, the vast majority of you, I'm sure, all come from middle class families. How many middle class families in India would even dare to think about allowing a servant, and we still call them servants in India, a servant to sit on a chair in their presence? The servant will not do it either, and they always are at a distance. How many will even think of the possibility that that person could share your dinner table, right? Who you take food from? What is this idea that this person is a Shudra? Who you eat with? All of these things are a fundamental problem in the history of India. The question is whether the new kinds of social distancing that have been mandated by the coronavirus pandemic, whether these kinds of problems get aggravated, you see, right? I'm saying that these are questions that we have to think about, right? Thirdly, it is very important to understand that though science can teach us some things, science cannot teach us everything. Science can give us all these rules about social distancing, masking, right? It can tell us what aerosols are. It can tell us why it is that we should not be in the presence of someone who's coughing, right? And that if someone is coughing, they shouldn't go out. Science will tell us how we are to understand that. But science cannot tell us everything. It cannot tell us, for example, everything that I've said to you thus far. Science has almost nothing to tell us about that. About what touch means to human communities, for example, right? The notion of the state, individual right, individual autonomy, how states use these rights. We have to turn to history, to literature, to the imagination. Kala, Sahitya, all of these are going to be very important. And I'll give you just one very simple illustration and then move on to my next point. And that simple illustration comes from the very famous novel, which has now been thrust upon everyone, if I may put it this way. So you remember what Shakespeare said about greatness: some are born great, right? And upon some, greatness is thrust, and some achieve greatness, right? Well, some have read Albert Camus. In some cases, Albert Camus has been thrust upon them, right? And what I'm referring to is Albert Camus' famous novel, The Plague, which is now being referenced by everyone who is somewhat educated and who's thinking about the plague, about the pandemic, all right? Because this is a novel that is set, in 1940, 1941 during World War II. And there is a character in the novel who says something which is really quite extraordinary. And what the character says is that, look, there's only one way in which we bring an end to the pandemic, to the epidemic. The word pandemic was not used then. There's only one way in which we bring an end to an epidemic or to a plague. What is that way? And he says, you can capture that in one word. That word is decency. Decency. We have to treat other people with decency. We have to understand the fact that most of us are doing quite well. I'm doing very well in the times of the pandemic. I have a fabulous position. I'm being well paid. I can work entirely from home. I don't have to endanger myself. I don't have to worry about where I'm going to get the next meal or the next 100 meals. Right? But there are such a large number of people ILO, International Labour Organization, has released figures suggesting that 700 million people have become unemployed after the pandemic broke out. The vast majority of these people will have no food that goes beyond a few days. Right? What is the nature of human compassion? This is what Albert Camus meant when he said that we have to really think about decency, right? That this is what is needed in these days, not the pandemic of hate, which is what we are seeing in many countries. Scapegoating people, right? And in Europe. So I'm giving you examples from all over the world because this is something that has global dimensions in every sense of the term. The Roma, what in India we call the gypsies, that's a colloquial word. The community is known as a Roma, right? Now, there is a long history that the Roma have always been scapegoated in Europe for every evil and every wrongdoing and everything that went wrong. Much like the Jews used to be scapegoated. The Roma have been scapegoated. And in this case also, we have seen that the Roma are being scapegoated. In the last several months, in many European towns and cities, people have tried to throw the Roma out, evict them, holding them responsible for having brought the coronavirus to Europe. Of course, they have nothing to do with it, right? So this is what Camus' character meant when he said that the only thing that will really save us from the pandemic, from a plague, is decency. At the end of the day, that is crucially what really matters, right? Number 4, the coronavirus is an occasion for us to think about what is actually the greatest problem of the day today. And I have to tell you that in the last election that we had in India, no political party even mentioned climate change in its election manifesto. You read the manifesto of the BJP, a 50-page document. You read the manifesto of the Congress. There was a very, very small mention, very small mention. You read the manifesto of the CPM. What am I referring to? I'm referring to what is by far the most colossal problem facing humanity. And if there's anyone here who thinks that this is a hoax, just like Trump thinks it's a hoax, they're actually, I'm going to say it clearly and loudly, they are actually ignorant if they think this is a hoax. I'm referring to the problem of climate change. There is overwhelming evidence of what is happening all around the world on account of climate change. One of the most interesting things that happened when the coronavirus pandemic broke out was that suddenly, within a month, the air was clean, the water was clean. Right? You saw creatures flying in the sky that you hadn't seen before. The birds came out. Swachh Vayu, clean air. It is said that in Jalandhar, there were people, it might be apocryphal. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not. I don't really care because certainly what is very clear is that there was a fundamental change. You can just look at the measurements that were taken, the atmospheric measurements that were taken, okay, in the months of April and May about the air in most cities in India. That it is said that in Jalandhar, the Himalayan range, which is 250 kilometers away, could never be seen by people. Now they could see it for the first time from their rooftops. Right? And there are very substantial changes. There are pictures that the Guardian had brought out of India Gate as it used to look a year ago, and India Gate as it looked at the end of April. I mean, a world of difference in these two photographs. Right? Because what happened? The machinery of life came to a standstill. The factories came to a standstill. Cars were not rolling down, the lines by the thousands. Ships were not moving from one port to another, carrying enormous amounts of tonnage. 95% of airline traffic was eliminated. 95%. I mean, in some countries, there was no airline traffic at all, including India. In the United States, it was never formally halted. International flights were, of course, but there were still domestic flights, but almost no one was flying. And you know that airlines are by far the biggest driver. That's one big difference of the coronavirus. That's one big difference between 1957 pandemic, which I spoke about, and this present pandemic. 1957, there was barely any airline traffic. There was no question of shutting down all the airlines back in 1957. Even in 1968, it was really a fraction. India's airline industry only really developed after new liberalization policies opened up. And India's airline traffic is still a fraction of the total airline traffic in China or the United States, even the domestic. But it's growing. It has been growing. But all of this came to a standstill. Consumption came to a standstill. People weren't shopping anymore. Yes, you could buy online, but we're talking about the levels of consumption coming down drastically. See, and of course, what is the biggest reason for global warming? It is what people would, the scientific way of putting it is the increasing use of fossil fuels, right? The massive use of fossil fuels, the burning of fossil fuels. But what is it that causes that? One of the principal things that causes that is massive increase in levels of consumption. We are all buying many more things than what we actually need. What this pandemic has shown is that it is perfectly possible to lead a reasonably good life without squandering your entire life just shopping, buying things, accumulating things, traveling from A to B for no reason whatsoever, right? And indulging in holidays here and there because it's a consumption. You know, you have money, you say, acha, a well-to-do family in India, chalo, aaj Switzerland chalte hain, agli garmiyon mein Malta jayenge. Then we'll even go to Galapagos Islands. I've encountered middle-class Indians who very proudly will tell everyone we've been to the Galapagos Islands. What took you to those islands? You know, are you interested in Darwinian evolution and trying to understand Darwinian evolution? You know, no, this is all a matter of consumption. What the coronavirus pandemic is doing, it is sending us a message that we have to rethink the basis on which we have crafted our lives. Right? And this brings me to the fifth and to the related point, but I want to put it much more sharply. And then I'll stop there because I want to take about 10 minutes for questions. We began about 20 minutes late, and I do absolutely have to finish in this whole session in about 15 to 17 minutes. Right? But the last point I really want to make is this. Think about what Gandhi said in Hind Swaraj. Now, I understand that Gandhi is not very popular in India. I found out 35 years. My earliest publication on Gandhi goes back to 1988. And 2 volumes of my collected writings of Gandhi are being published by Orient Black Swan next year. I've got about 50 papers. So I've been thinking about him for a long time. And I think that along with the Buddha, he is among the 2 greatest Indians ever, without a peer in modern history, without a peer by a long margin, in my judgment. And I was very glad to hear the foreign minister of India, whether he actually believes in it or not, but I was very glad to hear the external affairs minister of India say the same thing. And then the Nepalese government shot back at him saying, well, how dare you call the Buddha an Indian? Well, you know, this is the kind of pettiness, right? You know, he's a Nepali, right? So maybe now we'll have to rewrite all our philosophy books of Indian philosophy where the Buddha is included because he's not Indian, right? According to the Nepali. Anyhow, we shouldn't waste our time on those things, but that shows you the kind of petty xenophobic nationalism that you're finding everywhere, all over the world, right? So, what is it about Gandhi? In 1909, he writes a little book, which I think every Indian should read. It's called Hind Swaraj. Now, I don't have time to give a whole lecture on Hind Swaraj here. But one of the things that Gandhi says in Hind Swaraj is, he says, आधुनिक दुनिया का सबसे बड़ा रोग क्या है? What is the biggest disease of modern civilization? It is speed. Speed. Everything is being done with speed. Multitasking. I admit I do that too. I shouldn't be. I try not to do it. But I'm sitting at a dinner table, I'm having dinner with my family, or some other member of the family is doing it. At the same time, they're looking at their phone. At the same time, the TV is on, headline news. अरे भाई इतनी जल्दबाजी क्यों? What is the rush? Why are we speeding from one thing to another, rushing from one event to another, going from one tweet to another? Right? Speed is a disease. And Gandhi diagnosed it very carefully and articulately and with great wisdom and foresight in Hind Swaraj. And what the coronavirus pandemic has also taught us is to slow down. Luckily, there is nowhere to go. At least for several months, there was nowhere to go. You sit down at home, maybe read a book, maybe talk to family members, which you might not have done for a long time, right? Time to reflect, time to contemplate. So, wretched as our condition is because of the coronavirus pandemic, howsoever difficult it has made the lives of so many tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people, we also have to understand that something good may emerge from this if we think and reflect deeply enough. And I will end there. And I'll turn it over to you, Ravi, and take questions for no more than 10 or 12 minutes. Usually I would have been happy to take questions for 1 hour, 2 hours, but we started, as I said, quite a bit late, and I have another obligation exactly in 13, 14 minutes I have to end. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such a detailed discussion on the COVID, and sorry for starting late because of some technical reason. People were not been able to join because in this new mode, we also have to negotiate with lot of technical issues. So
I can't hear anything right now. Hello?
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I couldn't hear you the last 15 seconds. Yes.
Okay. No, actually, so despite a lot of technical problems we had during the lecture, it was fantastic to listen to Vinay sir again and again on different sites, and he has lucidly presented the 5 points related to the coronavirus, how the coronavirus not only has changed the world, but it has also changed the world view that we are living with, the perception we are living with, starting with the individual liberty and state control over everything, to the social distancing, limits of science, and problems of day-to-day problems that may lead to climate change, and some kind of COVID nationalism. He end with his concluded his lecture. So now, may I request all the listeners, because I don't want to take much time in commenting on the lecture. We are already late. So the floor is open, and anybody who have question, they can just unmute themselves and they can ask the question by giving the short introduction. Please be brief in asking your question. Don't give a parallel explanation about any point. You just be specific about your question. Now the floor is open, please. I think Aftab was asking some question. Aftab, are you there? Aftab? Aftab?
Yes, sir, I am here, but I don't have a question at the moment, right?
Okay. Because I just got a message.
But I actually was thinking about the issues that sir has raised. Actually, uh,
Okay.
all of these issues are, relevant, and I think we need to reflect upon that. But I was talking, thinking about way forward. How, how what are the? I mean, is there any philosophical change that is taking place today, or do we have any kind of possibility of, you know, reimagining our future based on the values that sir has actually talked about? Even the first question that he has raised, I think we can relate with all those questions that we have been experiencing, 5 points that sir has raised. But my question is that how to reclaim those values, and whether sir finds any kind of future actually in this kind of scenario. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I can answer the question, of course. I mean, I actually spoke about it towards the end, but I think, Ravi, because we are short of time, it may be a good idea if you collect a couple of questions, and then let me give one, you know,
Okay, sir.
concerted answer.
Ravi, I
Yeah,
have a question.
Yes, Vasudha,
This is
please.
Vasudha.
Uh,
Professor Lal, thank you so much for your talk. I was curious to know what do you think about the whole digital divide that has come up because of this whole coronavirus
yeah,
schooling, and most of the things have moved online. And that
yes,
also shows us a huge disparity in not
yes,
only the rural and urban areas, but within the urban areas as well, that
yeah,
access to online and internet and all these technical digital things have shown a
yes,
huge divide.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, no, I understand the question. All right.
next, next
Yep.
question. Anybody else?
Ravi,
Okay, while
if
people connect, go
Ah,
sorry,
ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
okay, if I am allowed, may I ask one more question, please?
okay. Go ahead.
Sir, I was also wondering that with this whole social distancing norms, which are flouted in the name of elections,
Yes,
and um, for elections there is social distancing. How is the state responsible for that? I mean, it adopts
yeah,
double standards in a way, and it
yes,
doesn't allow for the celebration of festivals. I mean, that's the general
yeah,
complaint we are listening to in this atmosphere of
yeah,
festivities. And when it comes to elections, the states are
yes,
violating their own codes.
yeah,
So
yeah,
thank you.
right.
Clear
Next.
about
Yeah,
that.
Thank
yeah.
you,
No,
Vasudha.
I
Thank you
understand.
Vasudha, for
Yeah.
two questions. Now, anybody else have a question, or we can have sir answering these two questions in the first round. In the second round, we can take few questions before concluding the lecture.
Yeah, sure, sure. All right. So, I mean, the last two questions are both by Vasudha, and I think both of them are actually very good questions. There was a question before that about how to reclaim the future. So, I mean, I actually spoke a little bit about that, right? Because, for example, I was talking about how we might have to creatively use literature, art, all of that. That we cannot simply rely upon science to give us a certain kind of narrative, and that we have to rethink our own relationship to communities. We have to, for example, learn to think about solitude. And those are all ways of thinking about how we're going to reimagine the future. We have to reduce our levels of consumption. Uh, what is the relationship, for example, between the coronavirus and climate change? I mean, this is the kind of issue that I was really addressing. So I think I've given some hints about that. And I want to leave it at that, because I think if one wants to pursue that further, then we'd need a lot more time, and some of this is discussed in my book as well. I want to come to the two questions that were raised by Vasudha. So one of the questions has to do with the digital divide. Now, she is doubtless right, completely right, that this is a very serious question, because what happened, even in India, of course, I mean, I'm living in the United States right now. I mean, I maintain an intimate familiarity with India because I spend 3 months there every year. This year, of course, has been an exception because since late January, I've not been able to go back. Um, but but of course I know what's been happening there, and I know what happened at, let's say, the elite universities especially, but even when I say the elite private universities, I'm referring to obviously universities such as Ashoka, for example, and Jindal and flame, for example, in Pune. But of course, the same thing happened at Delhi University as well. The best public universities that we have. I think when you go lower down, to the lowest rung of the badly managed state universities, the conditions are even much worse. Now, what am I referring to? What I'm referring to is that even in India, classes moved at the university level. I'm speaking about university, and I'm speaking about good public schools in India as well, right? I'm not talking about some rundown state-managed school in Bihar, which barely functions to begin with. I've been to such schools, where you have one classroom. If you have a classroom, the teacher barely shows up. The horror stories you've heard of, and unfortunately, many of them are true. I mean, this is how many of the schools are run in rural India and in the poorer states, right? But in the better to do schools, and especially the good public schools, and then in the universities, what happened in India is what happened, of course, all across Europe, the United States, Japan, large parts of China: online learning. Now, this online learning has enormous issues. We cannot get into all the political, philosophical, ethical implications of this, all right? But even in the most advanced countries, and here I mean by advanced simply those countries that are the wealthiest and that have a better technological infrastructure than we do in India, even in those countries there is actually a digital divide which has become sharper. Because, for example, there are students from ethnic minorities in the United States, from African American communities, from American Indian communities, Hispanic communities, who do not have the kind of access to internet learning or to what is called remote learning that middle class students and the well-to-do have, right? And it has to do not simply with availability of computers, it has to do with not even just availability of good internet connections. I mean, if you're living in a little, let's just take a very extreme example. You're living in a slum in India, right? I mean, look at Dharavi. I have a discussion of Dharavi in my book, because Dharavi for many months showed us a stellar example of how to contain the virus. Okay, people very often point to New Zealand as an example of a country that contained it. Well, you know what the density of population of New Zealand is? 15 people per square kilometer. The density of population in Dharavi is 1 million per square kilometer. I mean, it's the difference between night and day, right? I mean, you can't compare the two. And Dharavi was able to do a very good job. But how do you actually do remote learning in Dharavi? Right? I mean, in one room, there are 8 or 10 people sleeping in that room. Right? How do you bring internet connections? And then how do you ensure that a person can actually do that without having 10 young children screaming in a person's ears? Right? There are all these kinds of questions, right? So there is the political economy. There is a political economy of what we might call the digital divide. And that divide can be urban, rural, it can be upper class, lower class, it can also be high caste and lower caste in India. There are various ways in which you can think about it. I mean, there might be a gendered aspect to it. We have less work on that, for example, at the moment, but there certainly is. And I'm not even speaking about some other kinds of implications of remote learning, right? And the digital divide, which are exceedingly important. And I'm not, such as, for example, the fact that in many countries of the world, they are borrowing the American management model. They're basically trying to reduce full-time professors, hire more part-time adjunct professors, pay them a minuscule fraction of the wage that you pay to a full-time tenured professor, or what is called a permanent professor in India, right? And you get basically part-time staff. You pay them very little money. You don't have to pay them any kinds of benefits or anything. Because what they are finding is that, well, if you can actually teach a course through remote learning, why even actually bother having, a university? Why even bother having a brick institution, as it were, mortars and brick institution? Right? There are other aspects of the digital divide which I cannot get into because that's going to be a very long question. And then we would have to look at, for example, what's happening with social media and what is its place and the digital divide within understanding the pandemic. Then there was a question that she had asked about about social distancing norms that are being flouted. I mean, right now is festival season in India. You know, we have puja season in Bengal. We've got Durga Puja, we've got Dasera going on, Diwali is going to be coming up. Uh, and it is very clearly the case. And then, of course, you know, the elections coming up in Bihar. It is very clearly the case that when we look at these norms and we look at the role of the state, because I haven't really talked about the role of civil society in the brief remarks that I made, but there is no question. Number one, I want to make just simply 2 points here without elaborating on either in great detail. But number one, that even when the state sets certain social distancing or physical distancing, which is a term that activists in India would like to use for reasons that I've already hinted at, that there's already too much stigma in India with social distancing, that even when the state sets these physical distancing norms, the state itself will flout them when it wants to. Okay, and that has been shown repeatedly in India. It's been shown repeatedly in the United States. And the Trump regime is the most egregious offender in that respect. Okay, but secondly, what she's pointing to is a different aspect, and that is that civil society itself is very often flouting these norms. The fact of the matter is that there are people who are flocking to these festivals. The fact of the matter is that there are people who are not persuaded, or that yes, you know, masking is important, physical distancing is important. But I think in India, at least one can say only this, and I'm not saying this by way of exoneration, but at least one can say this, that frankly, there are some people who are not fully, who do not fully understand. They don't have the language to understand why it is that masking is important, for example. Okay, why is it that, you know, you observe a distance of 6 feet or 1 meter or 2 meters, whatever the case may be, right? But the question here is it possible to address this kind of pandemic without taking into consideration the ways in which civil society itself has to exercise, the different constituent elements of it have to exercise responsibility in their own fashion? And then the question of responsibility cannot simply, because very often the responsibility is a way by which we try to browbeat people into submission. Now, we would have to then understand what is the role of the state in the dissemination of a certain viewpoint, which it has to make every effort is going to be understood by people across the board. All right, so those are just some brief comments on the questions that were asked. And Ravi, I regret to say, but I don't think it's going to be possible to take any more questions because we're past 11 o'clock.
Yes.
So we're going to have to really finish the session at this point.
Okay. So I'm just taking one question from hers, the only one question, and my one brief comment, and after that we will conclude the session. So hers, are you there? Hers, because he. Uh, uh.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, no. Look, I mean, this is a very large subject. I mean, you know, how the positions that have been taken up by the Trump White House on the pandemic, what implications they have, how they play out in the elections. This is, I think this is a very large subject. I mean, how many people will be persuaded by the narrative on either side is a question that, frankly, no one really has an answer to. Because in order to understand these elections, we'll have to understand a large number of factors, including, for example, the rise of white supremacism. I mean, we have to understand what this present administration is seeking to do, what it's seeking to do. And I'll really conclude with that because, as I said, this is not a brief question, okay? What it's seeking to do is to restore the idea of a white America. Remember, the vast majority of you are probably not aware of this, that before 1965, when you had what is called the Immigration and Naturalization Act that was passed in the United States before 1965, it was nearly impossible for Indians to emigrate to the United States. Now, there's a period of time from 1923 until 1945 when Indians were officially excluded from the US. Large number of Asians were. They had what were called the Asian exclusion laws. 1965 changed all of that. I can't get into the history of it. What the administration is seeking to do effectively is to return the US to what it was like at that point in time, a predominantly white country. And the demographics in the US are against that at the moment. Okay, so that is all part of the story too. And within these different communities have adopted different positions on the question of how the Trump administration has handled it. All right. So, Ravi, yes.
Sir, I have two small comments. Don't you think that the coronavirus politics and the dominance of state that you have already talked about is creating some kind of two phenomena, which is as a student of political science, I feeling the politics of the anti-politics that people are not very much. We have to understand the idea of anti-politics when we are not fighting on the real issues of politics. And second, the rise and expansion of the populist regime, because most throughout the world we are seeing that states are working on the populism, not major focus is not on the policy measures to do the social structure changing and other thing. So how we can understand the coronavirus in the context of two new developments that I am thinking of, anti-politics and populist measure, as far as democratic states are concerned, because you have had a comparison of United States and India.
Yeah. Look, I mean, a very interesting questions, but it's not really possible for me to address them. This is not, you said small comments, these are very big comments, because the whole question of the idea of anti-politics is what the present regime is banking on. You see, it's banking on that, all right. I mean, for example, many people, they see, let me just conclude with that. For example, there is an allegation. In my view, the allegation is correct. The allegation is that this present government in India is seeking to produce a Hindu Rashtra. Okay, right? And so many people will say, well, that's actually a very political, that is politics. Well, it's politics, but it's anti-politics. Okay, and to understand that, then we would have to understand what is the nature of politics, what makes for political activity, what makes for a political being, right? And we would have to also link this to what I'm going to call the politics of knowledge. All right, so this is not a small matter that you're really referring to, and unfortunately, at the moment, I can't go beyond this. All right.
Thank you so much, sir, for your presence. And I request everybody, I'm showing the book. The book was released, I think, 3-4 days back. And somehow I'm lucky enough to have a copy of the book with the help of Professor Vinay Lal. And the book is quite worth reading and very interesting, actually, to know the nature of pandemic and how pandemic changes the nature of state. So the contract between citizens and the state is changing through the pandemic, and that we can know by reading this book. So I recommend that if you are really interested to know the changing times and how the state individual contracts are changing, please go through Professor Vinay Lal's book. And thank you so much, sir, for giving time and joining us. It's already about 11:30 in the night in Los Angeles. And I will just say goodbye and good night to you. And thanks for joining. I will share you the recording very soon. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining. And thank you once again, Ravi, for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, sir.
Okay.